After church one Sunday, a pastor was standing by the door greeting people as they left, and one sweet elderly lady stopped and said, "Pastor, could you please speak louder when you're preaching? I can't hear you." And he said very modestly, "Oh, you're not missing much." And she said, "Well, that's what I hear, but I'd still like to hear." This morning, I'm hoping that God will communicate something unique and special to each one of you, regardless of the quality of my sermon preparation. In fact, for the last several weeks, we've been talking about how you might respond if God spoke to you. Specifically, if God called your name, not just once, but twice. And in the Bible, as I've mentioned before, God calls plenty of people, and often by name, but there's only 7 times where God calls someone's name twice in a row. Abraham, Abraham, Jacob, Jacob, Moses, Moses, and so on. And each time God calls someone's name twice, He follows it with something profound and powerful and potentially life-changing. He called Samuel to demonstrate just how important it is for us to learn to listen to the voice of God. He called Martha to remind her to slow down and spend some time at the feet of Jesus. He called Simon Peter to warn him of the snares of Satan and to encourage him to get back up after he falls. And the last person that Jesus calls by name twice is Saul, who eventually becomes Paul. And the story of Paul's encounter with Christ is so compelling. It's actually told 3 times in the New Testament. We looked at one of them in my Sunday school class this morning. But it's first told as it happens in Acts chapter 9. And then Paul retells this story in Acts 22 and then again in Acts 26. So if you have a Bible and you're planning to follow along, you may want to open up to Acts 9 and then stick a ribbon or a finger in Acts 22 or 26. If you've got an app on your phone, your thumbs are just going to be working overtime to keep up. Of course, you can always just follow along on the screen as well. But I know this is a familiar tale, but I want to make sure that we remember the setting. And so I'd remind you that this takes place in the early days of the church. Saul was a Pharisee from a very important Jewish family. He once referred to himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews. In other words, when it came to religion, he was as religious as you get. In fact, Saul was very zealous about his religion, so zealous that he couldn't stand the idea of anyone leaving Judaism to become a Christian. And so as Christianity spread throughout the Jewish community after the death and resurrection of Christ, Saul just became enraged, and he made it his personal goal to put an end to Christianity. So in the name of Yahweh, he went after these heretics, these threats to his faith, and either arrested them or killed them. For months, the man born as Saul was the single greatest threat to Christianity. Bankrolled by Jerusalem's religious leaders, he passionately pursued Christ's followers all over Palestine, flogging them until they renounced their faith in Jesus. And those who remained firm in their faith, who wouldn't give up on Christ, he sent to prison or worse. It says in Acts chapter 9, verse 1 and 2, "Meanwhile, Saul was uttering threats with every breath and was eager to kill the Lord's followers." He was eager to kill them. So he went to the high priest. He requested letters addressed to the synagogues in Damascus, asking for their cooperation in the arrest of any followers of the way he found there. He wanted to bring them, both men and women, back to Jerusalem in chains. Saul received these letters that he requested and recruited some extra muscle for his mission. Armed and ready for any resistance that he might encounter, Saul and his henchmen mounted their horses and then blazed a trail on to Damascus. And along the way, however, Saul encountered the risen Christ, and everything changed, including his name. Around noon, as the story goes, Saul and his companions approached the city, and a blaze of light brighter than the sun, poured out of the sky onto Saul. And if you ever performed on stage, maybe in a pageant or a high school musical, You might know what it feels like to have a spotlight shining down on you. And, if it's a bright spotlight, you can actually feel the heat coming off of it. And it's kind of blinding, so you're squinting as you're looking out at the audience. But imagine a spotlight that's so bright, it actually outshines the noonday sun, shining down right on Paul. And so he literally falls to his feet, or to his knees, and shields his face. And then that's when he heard it. Someone was calling his name twice. The Bible says in Acts 26, verse 14, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is useless for you to fight against my will. And then Saul, just blinded and face buried in the sand, he cries out, who are you? And the voice responds, I am Jesus, who you are persecuting. Jesus certainly knows how to get someone's attention, doesn't he? And what I find most curious about Christ's conversation with Saul is Jesus' statement, it's useless for you to fight against my will. Older versions actually offer a more precise, if not more puzzling, translation. Literally, Jesus actually says here, and this is the New American Standard, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. That makes sense to most of us, right? Apparently, to kick against the goads was a common expression found in both Greek and Latin literature. It's a rural image which arose from the practice of farmers goading their oxen in the fields. And while it might be unfamiliar to us, everyone in that day understood its meaning. Goads were typically made from slender pieces of wood like this one, and they were blunt on one side so that you could kind of pat an animal to get it to move along, but on the other side it had a sharp piece of iron like a nail poking out of it, and that's for the really stubborn animals. When you couldn't just pat it and get it to move, you'd flip it around and whack it, and that would prod and poke and goad the animal in the right direction. And the ox sometimes, however, would rebel or resist this goading, and so they would just kick. They would try to kick the goad away, and in so doing, they would often just poke the bottom of their foot or their leg, and the iron piece would jab into it, causing more pain and injury than the initial tap would have caused. This is the image that Christ had behind his words. And, Saul's conversion to us as we read the New Testament might seem like a one-time encounter with Christ that just totally changed his life. But when I read Christ's words about Paul kicking back, I think that Jesus had been working on Saul for a long time, prodding and goading him in the right direction. See, quite likely Saul had heard Jesus teach and preach in public places. I mean, they were about the same age. They both ran in the same circles and hung out in the same cities. And so Jesus, as he's out there teaching and preaching in public, Paul was likely to have heard him and listened to his public teaching. I just picture Saul, he was kind of a shorter guy, so he was probably standing on his tiptoes looking over the crowd, trying to hear Jesus and just getting irate as he listened to this itinerant preacher saying things that he thought were heretical, nonsense, He must be from Satan. Pharisees love to think that about Jesus. Nevertheless, Jesus' ministry just stuck in Paul's mind. The words and the works of Jesus haunted this zealous Pharisee. And once you seriously encounter Jesus the way that Saul did, there's no escaping him. His words, his works, they just follow you deep within your conscience. But the more it goaded him, the more Saul kicked back and resisted. And I'm certain that God goaded Saul in other ways too. I mean, just think about all of the Christians that Saul assaulted or arrested. I mean, some of them must have shared their testimony with him. In fact, we know for certain that one of them did, Philip, or Stephen, that is, when he was being stoned to death. He actually got everybody to stop and listen to a sermon that tells the whole history of the Jewish people leading up to Jesus. And Saul was there for that. And as Saul was, dragging Christians through the streets in chains, I'm sure that some of them must have pled with him, you don't understand. Jesus is real. He's risen. He's changed my life. I mean, just think about some of the testimonies that Paul must have heard. I was blind from birth, but then I met Jesus and now I can see. Or I was lame for 38 years, but then Christ came into my life and now I can walk. Or I was deaf, but now I can hear everything thanks to Jesus. Or I was demon-possessed and Christ cast the demon out and now I'm free. Or, I ate the bread and the fish that Jesus multiplied when he fed the 5,000. I was dead for 4 days and Jesus brought me back to life. Or I saw the nail-scarred hands before Jesus ascended into heaven. And each time Saul heard these stories, it was like another goad just rapping him on the side, trying to nudge him and point him in the right direction. But Saul just kept kicking. He kept fighting against the goad. And what I find most ironic is that as a Pharisee, Saul really prided himself on his pedigree. He prided himself on the fact that he had studied and trained under Gamaliel, who was this very highly respected Jewish rabbi. And yet when Gamaliel first heard about this Jesus movement, he warned the Jewish High Council not to act too quickly. He reminded them that some time ago there was this fellow named Theodas who pretended to be someone great, and 400 Jews followed after him. But then he was killed, and all of his followers just went their various ways, and the whole movement came to nothing. And then he says there was this guy, Judas of Galilee, and he too got people to follow after him. But he died, and all of his followers scattered too. And so Gamaliel cautioned his fellow Pharisees, and he gave them this advice in Acts chapter 5, verse 38. He says, we should keep away from these men for now. We should leave them alone. I guarantee that if the plan they put into action is of human origin, it will fail. However, if it is from God, you won't be able to stop them. You may even discover that you're fighting against God. And these words must have, jabbed Saul in the side like a goad, right in the ribs, but he still kept kicking against it. The High Council agreed with Gamaliel. They thought, well, that's a pretty smart way to go about it, so let's follow his advice. But despite the wise words of his former mentor, Saul took matters into his own hands and ended up doing exactly what Gamaliel said he would do. He was fighting against God. And so finally Jesus had enough, and he took drastic measures. Christ took control of Paul, and he let him know that his rebellion against God was a losing battle. Paul's actions were as senseless as an ox kicking against the goads. He had passion and sincerity in his fight against Christianity, but he was headed in the wrong direction, the way God didn't want him to go. And so Jesus was going to steer him back onto the right path, even if that meant appearing to him in person and striking him blind for 3 days. And I just wonder how many of us are fighting against God like Saul did. Now, there's a powerful lesson in that Greek proverb about kicking against the goads. We too only hurt ourselves when we fight against God's will. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 15, verse 10, stern discipline awaits him who leaves the path. And when we disobey God, when we rebel against him, we become like that stubborn ox, just driving the spike deeper and deeper. And the Bible also says in Proverbs 13:15 that the way of the unfaithful is hard. Rebelling against God, going your own way, that's not always the easier path. Sometimes that's harder because God disciplines us and tries to bring us back to him. By resisting God's authority, we're punishing ourselves. You see, God has a plan for your life, just like he did for Saul. But oftentimes, God's plans and our plans don't line up together. They don't fit right. In fact, the Bible says in Proverbs 16:9, we can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps. In other words, we've got our own idea of how life should go. We have our own direction that we want to travel, but God is the one that's going to decide the right path for us. And so He's going to push and prompt and pull us in the right direction. When our plans don't line up with God's, we tend to resist, like a stubborn ox that keeps trying to go the wrong way. And so God pokes and prods us back on track. And He does that in a lot of different ways. It could be through a guilty conscience or a restless spirit. It could be through some sermon that you hear on the radio or through the wise counsel of a Christian friend. And in fact, the Bible specifically tells us in Ecclesiastes 12:11 that the words of the wise are like cattle prods. And the word translated cattle prods, that's the Hebrew equivalent of the Greek word goads. It's the same thing. He says the words of the wise are like cattle prods, painful but helpful. Their collected sayings are like a nail-studded stick which a shepherd drives his sheep. See, wise words, wise counsel, it hurts sometimes to hear the truth, but it helps us when we listen to it. And God goads each one of us in different ways for different reasons. You know, maybe you've got a habit that dishonors the Lord, and so God gives you a little prick now and then to try and get you to quit. Or maybe there's just a person in church that exemplifies the Christian walk, and you spend time with that person, and it kind of makes you realize how much you have to grow in your Christian walk. Or maybe you figure out that you've just been playing at this whole church thing and your commitment to the Lord is nominal at best and it needs to go deeper. Maybe God's speaking to you about tithing, or maybe you have a critical or judgmental spirit that needs to change, or your family needs more of you right now and you get some reminder about that. Maybe a relationship needs healing. Maybe God's calling you to ministry or to prayer. Or perhaps even like Saul, you're resisting God's call to accept Jesus, and you're just doing your best to handle life on your own without the Lord. And so the question I think that we all need to ask ourselves is, have I been kicking against the goads lately? And if you are, is it really worth it? I mean, rebellion carries a high price tag. We can resist. We can go our own way if that's what we want. But when we fight against God, we're only hurting ourselves. You know, it's so much better to heed God's voice, to listen to the pangs of conscience, the whispers of the Holy Spirit, and let God lead us. Remember the wonderful words of God to the people of Israel in Jeremiah 29, verse 11. It's a verse that so many of us treasure. He tells them, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." And isn't that what we all want? I'd love to tell you, by the way, that Saul, after he stopped resisting and surrendered his life to Jesus, that everything was just sunshine and roses. But if you've read your New Testament, you know that's not true. Choosing to follow Jesus made Saul's life difficult. You know, all of a sudden, he was on the receiving end of all that persecution. It was challenging, but it led to contentment and peace that he had never known before. Paul, had hope and a future in heaven. So let's make that our goal, to seek God's will for our lives and to be sensitive to His prodding. Now, I really hope that you've been blessed by this series, and I know a 7-week series is a little bit long. But if you've been with us all 7 weeks, then you know that when God calls your name twice, something wonderful is about to happen. God called Abraham twice to save his son and remind him that nothing should take God's place in our lives. He called Jacob twice to assure him that he didn't have to be afraid, that God would be with him wherever he went. He called Moses twice to tell him that he saw the suffering of his people in Egypt and he wanted Moses to get up and go do something about it. He called Martha twice to tell her not to worry so much, but instead to enjoy peace and intimacy with Jesus. He called Simon Peter to warn him that he would be tested and tempted, but even when he fell, he could get back up and he could keep going. And finally, he called Saul twice to make it clear that it is useless to fight against God's will for your life. So my final thought for you, my final question, I guess, in this series is this: is God calling your name? And if so, do you have the guts to respond. Maybe like Saul, you've been resisting God's call and God's will for your life. Maybe you've been kicking the goads and you're tired of struggling. If so, I want to invite you to quit fighting today. Embrace God's will for your life. Let Jesus be the Lord of your life. And if I can help you figure out how to do that, then I want you to come and talk with me. You can pull me aside after church, or you can call me at home. My phone number is on the back of the bulletin. Or you can just come forward now while we stand and sing together. Let's sing, church.